Several weeks ago, we had a hearing in the Armed Services Committee that outgoing Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified. And I serve on that committee. I took a fairly vigorous role in questioning that hearing. And we discovered quite a bit during that hearing that we did not know before. We discovered, number one, that during the course of the entire attack on Benghazi, that President Obama received one 15-minute briefing at the outset of the attack, and after that, neither the Defense Secretary nor the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had any conversation whatsoever with the President. We learned that both the Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were up all night in the Pentagon dealing with the situation on the ground, and neither one of them has any idea if President Obama was up that night or not. We learned that during the entire course of the attack on Benghazi, from when it started to when the last of the 4 Americans who were murdered died, neither the Secretary of Defense nor the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff had any conversation whatsoever with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. We learned that the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said he was, quote, surprised that Hillary Clinton said she was unaware that our ambassador said we needed more security there because their safety was compromised. And he said he was certainly aware of that. He was surprised. She says she was not. We learned that if more security had been requested by state, it could have been provided as defense provided it in Yemen. And if it had been provided, the 4 Americans, including our ambassador, would not have been killed. And the reason it was not provided is because the State Department never asked for it. And we learned that the reason after that attack that the site remained unsecured for 22 days. You had news reporters, CNN, walking and discovering confidential documents, was because the State Department never asked the Defense Department to secure the site. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said if state had asked them to, they could have secured it promptly and gotten any evidence we could about the perpetrators. Now, we learned a lot, but we need to learn a lot more. And in particular, I think it is utterly unacceptable that none of us in Congress have spoken with any of the survivors from Benghazi. We need to bring the survivors forward, allow them to testify, if need be, in a closed hearing. If they're confidential security matters, we can have a closed hearing. And if they're not, I think it would be far better to have a public hearing, because I think the American public has a right to know what happened. We also learned one other thing from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is he said that he knew, and the military knew, the instant the attack happened, that it was an organized military terrorist attack. And as he observed, they fired multiple mortar rounds at a rooftop and hit a rooftop with multiple mortar rounds. He said that is not easy to do, and random protesters can't do that. Which raises the obvious question why the President of the United States and the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations went before the nation and repeatedly said this was not a terrorist attack, this was some spontaneous protesters upset about some ridiculous internet video. If the military said they knew categorically it was a military attack, it seems to me we have very important questions to ask why the President told the American people something else. And it may not be a crazy inference to suggest that the fact that a presidential election was occurring just a few weeks later might have been a factor in that process. So, I think we need a lot more inquiry. I am pushing for a lot more inquiry, but I thank you for your question, because one of the keys to getting a lot more inquiry is having our elected officials hear from the citizens and voters that we want answers, because I guarantee you what the President, Harry Reid, and the news media want us to do is just move on. Just forget about it. As Hillary Clinton said in her farewell hearing, what more do you want? What difference does it make? Even worse, what difference does it make? It really was. Yes, sir.
I really believe that China is behind North Korea. How do we put skids on China?
Well, it's a dangerous question. You know, North Korea right now, it illustrates what a perilous world we live in. You know, the fact that you've got a nation that we know has nuclear weapons capacity, that has a stated, and not just capacity, but nuclear weapons, that has a stated intention to use those weapons. Indeed, they publicly broadcast they are targeting U.S. cities, including, astonishingly, the city of Austin. It's easy actually to make light of it. Indeed, I was down in Austin last night, and more than a few people were making light of it, observing they didn't seem to realize they were targeting the People's Republic of Travis County. But you know, at the end of the day, we have to treat it seriously. If you have a nation that has nuclear weapons, that has stated an intention to use them, that has stated an intention to target U.S. cities, I think we need to treat that with enormous seriousness. And I do not disagree. The close relationship between North Korea and China makes it all the more perilous. And it is all the more reason why we need a president who can credibly stand up and say, we will defend the United States of America, and if anyone dares to think of anything like launching an attack on the U.S. homeland that takes the lives of U.S. citizens, the result will be a horrific consequence. Because it is that credible deterrence that protects our safety. And I do have some real trepidation that with this president, that bullies and tyrants throughout the world do not fear that reaction, and as a result are more likely to initiate hostile activities. I hope that is proven wrong. I do have considerable faith in the leaders of our military. But at the end of the day, there's one commander-in-chief. And it is certainly our responsibility in Congress to try to ensure that our nation does everything we can to protect our national security. Yes, sir, in the back.
Okay, yes. In relation to all the recent discussion about gun control, a friend of mine and I were having another discussion recently. Which makes it trivial at first, but it really goes to show deeper what our real point of the Second Amendment is. And originally, we argued that they intended it for us to protect ourselves against the tyrannical government. So, because of that, that would require that we be able to fight against the government, the military, and so forth. But today, does that mean, or do we believe what that means, what citizens should be able to own military-grade weapons? I mean, even such as like tanks and barge vehicles like that?
Well, I would point out that the sheriff of this county is certainly a believer in that regard. I'll tell you what the Supreme Court has said, because the Heller decision, which was the landmark decision in which the Supreme Court upheld the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, and that was a case I was intimately involved with. At the time, I was the Solicitor General of Texas and represented Texas and a total of 31 states before the Supreme Court, defending our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. What the Supreme Court said in Heller is the Second Amendment protects weapons that are in common use, and in common use for defense. So at issue in Heller in particular was handguns. The District of Columbia had prohibited all handguns, and it prohibited all operational long guns. They required rifles and shotguns to be disassembled or have trigger locks on them at all times. And the Supreme Court said, by any measure, handguns are in common use for defense. Accordingly, they fall within the parameters of the Second Amendment. They are protected. What the Supreme Court also said is weapons that are dangerous and unusual, and they gave examples like tanks and bazookas, do not fall within that protection. That's the line of what the citizens in common use could expect to defend themselves against versus dangerous and unusual weapons. That is very much the line of argument we've been having with Dianne Feinstein's so-called assault weapons ban, which does not in fact ban assault weapons. What think of as assault weapons are fully automatic machine guns. But fully automatic machine guns have been functionally illegal since 1934 for the vast majority of citizens. What Dianne Feinstein's bill would do is ban semi-automatic rifles, one trigger pull, one bullet, that are functionally identical to deer rifles, of which there are millions, if not tens of millions, in public ownership, based on certain cosmetic features, like whether it has a pistol grip. Essentially what the bill does is bans scary-looking guns. and they're identical in operation to guns that don't look as scary, which are not banned, and that's why when the same law was in effect for 10 years, 3 different studies paid for by the Department of Justice found that it had zero effect, none whatsoever, on violent crime. Because if you ban scary-looking guns, it makes politicians feel good, but it doesn't actually stop violent crime. In fact, let me suggest a different approach that would do a lot more to stop violent crime. Because a lot of what happens in Washington, to go back to Shakespeare, is full of sound and fury signifying nothing. A lot of Washington politicians like to come out and give a speech about all the great things they're doing, but not actually address the problem. One thing I bet most of y'all did not know. The Obama administration, for the last 4.5 years, has made it essentially zero priority to prosecute felons and fugitives who illegally try to purchase guns. Let me give you some simple stats. In 2010, there were over 70,000 people who tried to purchase a firearm, were turned down because they failed the background check. Of those, over 15,000 were felons and fugitives. Of those 15,000, the Obama Justice Department prosecuted 44. Let me repeat those numbers. Out of 15,000 felons and fugitives who tried to illegally purchase a firearm in 2010, the Obama Justice Department prosecuted 44 of them. We had a hearing in the Justice Department where a police chief from a northeastern city yelled at a senator, and when asked why these cases weren't being prosecuted on the state level or federal level, said, "We don't have time for paperwork violations." Well, you know, I think if we've got a violent felon who's trying to illegally purchase a gun, I'd like to know why they're doing that. And I certainly think prosecuting that crime is a heck of a lot higher priority than trying to take away the rights of law-abiding citizens in this room and strip away our Constitution. We'll do one final question. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of people in this country are worried about the billions of rounds of hollow points and some of the sophisticated vehicles that are being purchased by Homeland Security. Do we have anything to worry about?
Okay, and let me take the question of the lady behind you as well.
That's what I was going to ask.
Oh, it's the same.
If the government is buying up all the ammunition?
You know, it is a good question, and I'll tell you there are a lot of people who are understandably concerned about it. What I can tell you is my office has made inquiries of the Department of Homeland Security, the federal government, to find out what the facts are. And we have not yet gotten the facts. And so I want to be cautious about addressing this until I know the facts. I understand the concern, and part of the concern is driven by a real distrust for this administration. Because this administration has demonstrated a pattern of disregarding the limits on its authority that are within the Constitution. And so I fully get that. We are trying to get to the bottom of this, but I want to be cautious about saying anything until I know what the facts are. Let me just wrap up by saying to all of you, you know, some folks have said, you know, gosh, is it tough having the news media or a bunch of left-wing nitwits, although I repeat myself. Is it tough having them say all sorts of mean and nasty things about you? And I got to tell you the truth, it isn't at all. Because you know what? Those guys aren't the guys that elected me. Every day, you know, I think there was a gentleman, an older gentleman, who came up to me, shook my hand, said, "Ted, we've never met before. I'm 74 years old. I'm retired. I gave you $2,500 for the primary out of my retirement savings. And he said, tonight I'm giving you another $2,500 for the runoff out of my retirement savings. Because if we don't stop what's happening in this country, my retirement savings is going away." You know, I think of someone like Maggie Wright, who many of you know, grandmother from Burleson, Texas, took an old pickup truck, erected a gigantic billboard on the back of her truck for our campaign, drove all over the state of Texas, giving away thousands of yard signs. And Maggie's not someone you can tell no to, say no to. You know, I think of someone like Dwayne Schaefer. He's an activist in North Texas. On the day of the runoff, he had a very, very serious, life-threatening, potentially surgery. That evening, as he came out of anesthesia about 7:30, his son Raz texted him and said, "My dad just came out out of anesthesia, didn't know the outcome of the operation." The first words out of his mouth were, "What are the numbers in the runoff?" And I will tell you, having traveled this journey as we have together these last 2.5 years, has been the most humbling and inspirational experience of my life. Because in every decision that I face in Washington, I think back to the countless men and women who clasped me on the shoulder and they've said, "Ted, please, don't go to Washington and become one of them." Amen. It's the men and women in this room that I feel accountable to every day. And it is an extraordinary privilege to have the chance to fight for you every day. I feel blessed because together we're fighting to turn our country around. Thank you.